Put out the sea chest, Miss Carew. The counting house has no further use for a tallyman's brat. Julian Thorne stood in the doorway of the little dockside office, while the clerk behind him looked hard at his own boots. Marion Carew did not rise from the stool at once. She finished the column she was adding, laid the pen in the tray, and only then looked up at the harbor-master's agent in his fine bottle green coat. Her father had kept the books of that counting house for 22 years, and had been in his grave for 5 weeks. "There is a claim coming against the Locksmere estate, Mr. Thorne," she said, "and the whole of the answer to it is written in my father's hand, in ledgers you cannot read and would not know how to search. I am the only person left on this quay who can find it." Julian Thorne's smooth young face did not change by a hair. "A claim upon a great estate is a matter for gentlemen, Miss Carew, and for their lawyers, not for a woman who counts barrels. The chest. And you will have the good sense to be gone from the harbor cottage by Saturday next." She stood then, and took the small iron-bound sea chest that held everything she owned in the world, and she did not weep, and there was a quietness in the way she went out past him that ought to have troubled a wiser man. It did not. Julian Thorne could not know that before the leaves turned, he would carry that same chest back up the quay with his own 2 hands, in front of Lord Ansell Devereux and 2 of the coldest lawyers in the west of England, and set it down at her feet, and bow. He could not know that 400 acres, 9,000 pounds, and the good name of a barony would come to hang upon a single water-stained page of a ship's manifest that only this dismissed young woman would ever think to look for. But before we go on, subscribe now, and tell us in the comments where in the world you are watching from, and what the hour is where you sit. To understand what that manifest proved, you have to go back past the funeral, past the spring, to the harbor itself. Locksmere lay where the gray river widened at last into the sea, a small proud port of stone quays and salt-stained warehouses, and above it, on the green rise where the marsh gave way to good land, stood Locksmere House, seat of the Devereux barons for 200 years. The barony owned the quays and the customs shed, and took its tolls on every cask of wine and bale of wool that crossed those flagstones, and had done so, the deeds said, since the days of the first King Charles. But the oldest and least regarded room in all that great concern was not the panelled office where the tolls were reckoned. It was the low ledger loft above the counting house, a long, dim room smelling of tar and old paper, where the manifests of 200 years of shipping lay stacked in bundles, ship by ship and voyage by voyage, back to a time when half the world was still a rumor. Tens of thousands of pages, 2 centuries of the port's memory, and for 22 years one man had kept it. Thomas Carew had come to the Locksmere quay as a young tally clerk and never gone anywhere else. His wife died of a fever off the marsh when their daughter was small, and so Marion was raised in that loft, learning her figures before her letters at her father's elbow. He taught her to tally a cargo faster than a grown clerk, and taught her the shorthand the pursers used, the old contractions, the private marks each owner set on his goods, a whole secret language of commerce that almost no one on the quay could still read entire. At 12, she found an error in a wine merchant's account that had run 3 years undetected, and her father let the head clerk take the credit, and told her that a keeper of records serves the truth and asks nothing back from it. By 18, she could name the ship, the master, and the year of a loose manifest page by the hand it was written in. The old lord, the last Baron Devereux but one, used sometimes to climb the loft stair to hear Thomas talk of the great voyages, and he would say that Locksmere kept 2 fortunes on its quay, and only one was counted in the customs shed. Then the old lord died, and a year and a half after him, in the raw end of winter, Thomas Carew followed. He had insisted on finishing the year's tally in the unheated loft, took a cold into his lungs off the marsh damp, and was gone in 9 days. Half the quay stood bareheaded in the March wind at the churchyard on the hill, and the parson spoke of a faithful servant, and Mr. Thorne sent a wreath that was exactly correct and not one flower more. On the last clear evening, when the doctor had given over pretending, Thomas pressed into his daughter's hands a small leather tally book, worn soft as a glove, his private key to the whole loft. 22 years of knowledge set down in his own cramped hand. His last plain words were not of heaven and not of her. He said, if ever they question the marsh bar, Marian, the fair runner. Remember the fair runner. The new lord buried the Tallyman with honor and had not the least idea what he had lost. Ansel, 6th Baron Devereux, was 32 years old and had spent 9 of those years at sea in the king's navy, so that the estate he came home to was very nearly a stranger's house. Society called him proud. The quay called him distant. The truth was plainer and lonelier than either. He had come ashore to ledgers he did not understand, and to an agent who managed the whole of the harbor concern, and managed, very nearly, the young lord along with it. Julian Thorne was but 27 and had risen fast. He was clever, tireless, and honest to the farthing, and his fault was not that he stole. His fault was that he was certain. He was certain the ledger loft was 200 years of rotting rubbish, and certain that the daughter was a charity that had outlived the man who bestowed it. In the first mild week of April, a letter came down to the estate lawyers from the agents of Sir Hector Bligh, of Bligh and Company, the great shipping house of the next port along the coast, and the quiet of Locksmere ended. Sir Hector laid claim to the whole of the Marsh Bar quay, 400 acres of tidal foreshore and warehouse and mooring, the richest landing on that coast, which brought the barony near £700 a year in tolls and rents. His proofs were a crown foreshore grant of the year 1701, and an attested copy of a conveyance made in 1740, and his lawyers observed, with the smoothest courtesy, that the original title by which Locksmere held that quay had never once been produced before any court. The estate's lawyers, Messrs. Sowerby and Vane of the county town, wrote back very plainly. If the original could not be shown, the copy would rule, and the copy leaned toward Bligh. To lose meant the quay itself, and the tolls with it, and the costs of the suit besides, upward of £9,000 all told. Nor was it a matter only of the barony's rents. Every chandler and cooper and porter on that frontage held his living at the estate's hand. Old Ephraim Gurnell, whose family had rigged ships off the Marsh Bar for 4 generations, and the 2 crews of lightermen and the sail loft all worked that quay by the barony's leave, and if Bligh and Company took it, they would put in their own men and turn the old ones off. A wharf on that coast was not a line drawn on a crown map. It was bred. Thorne's answer was to send to London for an expert. Mr. Cornelius Proud came down by the coach with beautiful side whiskers and a still more beautiful opinion of himself, an antiquary who had ordered the papers of a shipping company for a fee that was talked of, and never once in his life been told to his face that he was mistaken. He dined with the Lord his first evening, and spoke wonderfully of documents he had handled as another man speaks of the horses he has ridden, and the Lord went up to bed unable to say whether he had engaged a scholar or a play actor. He took a room at the Harbour Inn, and told the potboy who carried a bundle of manifests up under one arm rather than 2 that he was a clumsy dog. In the agent's parlor above the counting-house, Thorne set out the household's position with the calm of a man squaring a column of figures. The girl is a charity that has outlived its cause, he said. Her father was a servant who counted other men's goods. She has got it into her head that counting made her a clerk. Mr. Proud is a gentleman of reputation. Whatever there is to be found in that loft, he will find it, and if there is nothing, he will say so, and we shall settle and be done. And the matter was thought settled. That was the week the sea chest was put out. Marian took one room in the harbor town, up under the eaves of Widow Sennin, the pilot's widow, at $1 the week. She earned the $1 copying fare the manifests and clearance papers for the little coasting masters who could not write a clean hand themselves, and they did not care in the least that she was a woman, for she got their papers passed at the customs shed on the first showing, which no one else on that frontage could promise them. She did not speak of Locksmere House. But the house came down to her, in the person of Nan, the youngest of the kitchen maids, a small, sharp-eyed girl, who had loved old Carew because he had once, when she broke a good jug, quietly mended it and told no one. If the housekeeper had learned where Nan spent her half-day, she would have been turned off without a character. She came all the same, every week, down the back lane with candle ends in her apron and the news of the house. And the news was all of Mr. Proud. He had untied 100 bundles and understood the marks on perhaps 10. He had called a wine ship's manifest a slaver's log and been very grand about it, and he had pronounced whole shelves of the oldest manifests worm-eaten waste, of no use to any suit, and ordered them set aside to be cleared out and burned. For the loft, he said, wanted air and light if a gentleman was to work in it. And so, in the 2nd week of May, Marian put on her plain gray gown, took up her father's quay ledger, which was the estate's property, and had to go back, and walked down the long stone quay to return it, and to see what might be seen. A clerk left her waiting in the passage below the loft stair, beside the agent's parlor, and the parlor door was not quite shut. She had not meant to listen. Then she heard the word grant, and after that she did not stir. There is no first grant. Thorn, Mr. Proud's voice came rich and easy through the gap. There is a harbor legend of a grant. Every old port has one, the way every old house keeps a ghost, and it is worth precisely as much. I have gone through the loft. Wine ledgers, wool tallies, purser's lists, rubbish, counsel the Lord to settle while Sir Hector will still leave him his costs. And when the loft is cleared, let me have the waste paper at $1 the hundredweight. No man living can read it, so it is worth no more than its weight to the trunk maker. There was a pause, and the small ring of a decanter on a glass. His lordship will sign what I set before him, said Thorn. He has signed everything I have set before him since he came ashore. Marian laid the ledger on the bench and walked out past the tally desks with her face composed as still water, and not one clerk who glanced up knew that the last defense of the Locksmere quay had just made up its mind to fight. That night, by 2 of Nan's candle ends, she wrote a memorial to the Lord, 11 pages, in the fair clerk's hand her father had drilled into her before she was 10. The whole history of the Marsh Bar Quay, how the foreshore had first come to the family by a grant of the 2nd King Charles, in gratitude for a ship the first Devereux had fitted out at his own cost for the king's service, and how somewhere in the record of that ship lay the proof of the grant. She named the ship her father had named with his last breath, the Fair Runner. She sealed the memorial and gave a carrier's boy 2pence to carry it up the hill. 4 days after, it came back down to the harbor unopened, and across the wrapper, in the agent's exact clean hand, ran a single line. His lordship does not correspond with the daughters of dismissed clerks. What Marian did with that letter was lay it flat inside her father's tally book, square and pressed, the way another woman might press a flower, and in the evenings, shut out of the loft, she began to build it again on paper. From the little tally book and a whole life's memory, she set down bundle by bundle what stood under the eaves of that ledger loft. 200 years of shipping reconstructed at a widow's kitchen table by the one soul now forbidden to touch a page of it, until the whitewashed wall above the settle was papered over with a room she was no longer let into. Somewhere in that room was the fair runner. Among all her father's exact entries there was a single line she had never been able to unriddle. 4 words set against the ship's name in his private shorthand. Where the salt is kept. And no bundle in all her memory held salt. What she did next was go down to the marsh bar quay itself, at the low spring tide, when the sea drew back off the flats and left the old works of the harbor bare. The morning came in still and pearl gray, the mud shone, and she went out along the causeway with a board and paper and a pencil, and began to draw what the old Grant described, the line of the ancient sea-wall and the mooring rings, because a boundary of the foreshore is not only words on a crown map, it is stones and the old high-water mark, and stones outlast clerks. She was crouched at the foot of a great mossed granite mooring post, old past all account, when she heard boots on the causeway behind her, and a voice, dry and level. "You are trespassing on the estate's foreshore, madam." She did not turn straight away. She finished the line she was drawing. "So is Sir Hector Bligh, sir," she said, "and I at least am doing it with a pencil, and not with a writ." She looked up then. The man standing over her was tall, bare-headed, plainly and darkly dressed, with a lean weather-browned face and the still eyes of a man who had spent years watching a horizon. "And what is it you are drawing?" "The salt stone, sir." She laid her flat hand upon the old post. "That is its name, in every clearance paper this port ever swore by. This is where the old sea wall stood before the great tide of the year 1703 threw it down, and the true boundary runs from this stone to the Fulling Weir, along the old high water mark, and not along the line Sir Hector's map has drawn, which is the sea as it lies now, 100 years further out. The sea moved, sir. The Grant did not." He was quiet a moment. Out on the flats a curlew cried. "And who taught you to read a foreshore as if it were a deed?" "My father, sir. He kept the ledger loft of this quay for 22 years. And he is dead. And I am told the suit is a matter for gentlemen. And if it were yours to argue," he said, "what would you do?" "I would find the fair runner, sir. My father staked his last winter upon her, and I do not mean to stand by and let a clerk dead since Queen Anne take 400 acres of quay from the living men who work it." She gathered her board and rose, and dropped him a curtsy exactly as deep as a stranger's do, and no deeper. "Good morning, my lord." And she walked away up the causeway with the tide whispering in behind her, and left the 6th Baron Devereux standing on the wet sand of his own harbor, outread, outmannered, and wholly unable to account for why the wreck of his morning felt like the first honest half-hour he had spent since he came ashore. He walked out onto the flats again the next morning at the ebb, and the causeway was empty, and he was surprised how ill the emptiness sat with him. Her name, when he asked his agent that evening, came to him wrapped in a soft parcel of pity. "Carew's daughter, my lord." Grief takes some women hard. She has been writing letters, I am sorry to say, up to the house. It is a kindness not to answer them. May turned into June, and the hearing was set down for the last week of July, at the summer assizes in the county town, and Mr. Proud delivered his written opinion in the great library with all the assurance of a sermon read from a cushion. No original Grant survived. The harbor tradition of the king's gift and the ship called the Fair Runner was, in his professional judgment, a fable of the sort every old port cherishes. His lordship would be well advised to settle, and Sir Hector Bligh, smelling the wind, grew generous in the way of men who believe they have already won. And one gray morning his agents posted a bill upon the customs shed giving the lightermen and the chandlers notice to quit against Michaelmas. And old Ephraim Gurnell stood on the frontage with his sons and read it. 4 generations of their rigging trade served with a paper, and the quay talked of nothing else for a week. And then Thorne, tidying up the world he was so certain of, did the one thing that could not be undone. He gave the order to clear the loft for Mr. Proud's comfort, and the oldest bundles, the ones the antiquary had condemned, were carried down the loft stair in 2 great tar-caulked sea chests, and sold as waste paper to Kemble, the trunk-maker of the next town, at a shilling the hundredweight, to be pasted into the linings of traveling boxes. Nan saw the chests go up onto the carrier's cart at 6 in the morning. By 8 Marian was on the counting-house quay in her gray gown, bareheaded, asking, in front of all the assembled morning clerks, that the chests be sent for, and brought back at the estate's own charge. The head clerk looked hard at the flagstones. And Mr. Proud, filling the loft-stair doorway with his watch chain, looked down at the tallyman's daughter and laughed aloud. "Madam," he said, "if you can read a purser's list of the reign of King Charles II, then I am the Lord High Admiral of England." The laughter went round the quay the way laughter does when a man's wages hang on joining in. Marian let it die. "Then pray my Lord High Admiral," she said, "that the trunk-maker is slow with his paste-brush." And she turned and took the coast road 11 miles on foot to Kemble's town, with everything she owned knotted into a square of cloth. 4 pounds and 2 shillings, the whole of what the coasting masters had paid her since March, and her father's silver watch besides, in case the money should fall short. It was high June, and the road ran white along the cliffs, and she counted the milestones the whole 11 miles, and a fish cart carried her the last 3, and would take not a penny for it. Kemble the trunk-maker was a broad, slow, careful man whose shop smelled of glue and cut deal. He heard her out with his big hands flat on his bench. Then he waved the watch away, took the 4 pounds for what he had paid and the carriage besides, and carried the 2 sea chests to his own door with his own arms. "I've a girl of my own, miss," was all he said. "Take your paper home." It took a farm cart and the last of her shillings to bring the chests down the coast, and 3 nights at Widow Sennon's kitchen table, by tallow light, to sort them. Wine tallies gnawed by rats, a tide surveyor's account of the great storm, bundle after bundle of nothing but wool. Widow Sennon kept the fire fed and asked not one question, which is its own love. And then, near the bottom of the second chest, wrapped in a scrap of old sailcloth stiff with tar and salt, a squat parcel of pages sewn between 2 thin boards of ship's deal, and her hands knew it before ever her eyes did. It was a purser's book, bound between the very deal boards it had sailed under, stiffened all through with the crust of 2 centuries of sea salt. And with her hands flat upon those salt-hard boards, the 4 words that had beaten her for weeks fell open like a lock. "Where the salt is kept." Her father had not wandered in his last hour. He had been naming her the very bundle. She went through the parcel with a lamp at her elbow and the widow's paring knife, and cut the tarred thread from the deal boards, and there, sewn flat between the last board and the sailcloth, brown and stiff and whole, lay a folded document, and along its lower edge, still bright, ran a line of the old king's clerkly hand and the ghost of a red seal. She read the first lines and had to set it down and walk twice round the kitchen before her hands would hold it steady. It was the manifest and clearance of the fair runner, fitted out at Locksmere at the charge of the first Baron Devereux in the year 1660 for the king's service in the Dutch war. And endorsed upon its face was the king's grant of the marsh bar foreshore to the family in payment for that ship, with the boundary written out plain from the Saltstone to the Fulling Weir, along the old high water mark. Pinned through one corner was a slip of paper in a hurried later hand, sewn safe from the king's excise men who would seize the quay for arrears. God keep the true grant. Some tally clerk of a hard year, threatened with seizure of the whole foreshore for unpaid dues, had sewn the barony's one proof into a dead ship's stores book and hidden it among the salt where no excise man would ever dig, and had died before the danger passed, and the hiding had outlived every man who knew of it. 2 nights on from that, at 10 o'clock, in a driving sea rain, someone knocked at Widow Sennon's door, and it was the Lord. He had ridden to the county town that week to instruct Sowerby and Vane to settle, and old Sowerby, folding away his spectacles, had put him one question. Had the fair runner ever been run to earth? Carew had written of that ship for years, and Carew was not a man to chase a fable. The Lord had demanded every letter of Carew's on the file, and among them found mention of a memorial sent up to the house in May, and back at Locksmere had asked his agent to bring it to him, and watched the first crack run clean through 27 years of the young man's certainty. You returned it to her unopened, the Lord said. I did not judge it worth your lordship's time, said Thorn. You have made a great many judgments about my time. The girl is grieving, my lord. It is a kindness not to encourage her. You have told me twice now what is a kindness, Thorn. I begin to want to know what is the truth. And now he stood dripping in a pilot's widow's kitchen, his hat in both hands, while the old woman gaped down from the stair, and on the scrub deal table between the 2 teacups lay a folded manifest with the ghost of a red seal, and the 6th Baron Devereux looked down at it and could not make out one word of the old hand. Marian turned up the lamp. Then I will read it to you, my lord, she said, and in that low room, in a voice as level as the tide, she read out a purser's list of the reign of King Charles II, as though the man had ruled it that morning, and the lord stood in his soaked coat and heard 400 acres of his own harbor come home to him. He came again the next night, and the night after with Sowerby's young clerk to take the notes, while Marian made the fair translation and set the proofs in order. He watched her finger go down the salt-stained lines without one stumble, and said very little. But on the 3rd night, at the door, with the rain blown out and the lane smelling of wet thrift and tar, he turned back. My harbor has been the better kept, he said, from this kitchen this week than from my own agent's parlor these 2 years. Then he asked her, quite abruptly, what she meant to do when the suit was ended, and she looked down at the manifest between the cups. Finish my father's catalogue of the loft. Someone must, or 200 years will be lost for want of a hand to hold it. He had no answer ready, and he rode home the long way, out along the causeway, past the Saltstone standing black against a sky just clearing to stars. 2 weeks before the assizes, the Lord called a conference at Locksmere House, and Sir Hector Bligh came up the hill expecting a surrender. The great hall was set out like a court of law that had sat down to dinner, the long oak table dressed in green baize, and the 2 centuries of Devereux barons looking down from their dark frames. Sir Hector sat with his council, Mr. Ravenhill, King's Counsel, a spare grey man with a mind like a hone. Sowerby and Vane sat for the estate. Mr. Proud arranged his papers with the flourish of a conjurer. Thorn stood at the Lord's shoulder, where he had stood at every reckoning for 2 years, and along the paneled walls, because his lordship had given no order to clear the hall, the whole household found errands that did not exist, for the servants of a great house always know when history has come up the drive to dinner. Mr. Proud performed first, and in its own way it was a masterly thing. The loft gone through, the tradition weighed, the fable of the king's gift regretfully laid to rest. No original grant had ever existed, and gentlemen do not go to law upon a harbor legend. Thorn stood through the whole of it without expression. Then Mr. Ravenhill set out his client's terms with a terrible gentleness. The Marsh Bar Quay to Bly and Company, each side to bear its own costs, generous terms. The offer open until the long case clock upon the gallery struck the hour, and the clock gave them its slow, deliberate tick, and Sir Hector regarded the young lord with the mild pity a man spares another, who is about to lose the finest thing he owns. The lord let the silence sit its full length. Then he stood. "Before I set my name to the loss of 400 acres my family has held since the days of the second King Charles," he said, "this house will hear one witness more." He nodded to the great doors, and the doors opened, and the whisper ran the length of the walls before ever she had crossed the sill. Carew's daughter, the tallyman's girl, her that walked to Kemble's Town and bought the paper back off the trunk maker with her own wages. Marion Carew walked the full length of the great hall of Locksmere in her plain grey gown, carrying the little iron-bound sea-chest, with every eye in the room fixed upon her and her chin held perfectly level. The housekeeper stopped looking down her nose. Mr. Proud's neck went the color of the hawk in his glass. Sir Hector turned to the lord with his brows climbing. "Is his lordship's case to be pleaded by a laundry maid?" "By the keeper of my records," said the lord. She set the sea-chest upon the green baize, and out of it, in their order, she laid 3 things. The attested copy of 1740 out of Bly's own bundle, handed to her with a puzzled little bow from Mr. Ravenhill, the purser's stores book of the fair runner, open to the master's endorsement, and then unfolded from its sailcloth with both her hands, the manifest itself, the ghost of the red seal along its edge, 200 years old and clear as the day the purser wrote it. "The manifest and clearance of the ship Fair Runner," she said, "fitted out upon this quay, at the charge of the first Baron Devereux, in the year 1660, for the King's service in the Dutch War. Endorsed upon its face is the King's grant of the Marsh Bar foreshore, made to the family in payment for that ship. I will read it, and then I will read the copy, and you shall see what became of it." And she did, slow and level, the old clerk's list filling the paneled hall where it had not been spoken aloud in 200 years, from the salt stone along the old sea-wall as it then stood, to the fulling weir, together with the mooring rings and all the foreshore lying between the marks of high and low water. She let it stand a moment. Then she laid her finger upon Bly's copy. "Now the copy of 1740, gentlemen. The clerk who drew this set the seaward line not along the old high-water mark that the grant names, but along the mark of the sea as it lay in his own day, 100 years and 100 yards further out. For the great tide of 1703 had thrown down the old sea-wall and moved the water. Draw the line where he drew it, and 400 acres of the barony's foreshore cross over to Bly and Company on one clerk's carelessness. Sir Hector's whole claim rests upon a copy of this very grant, drawn by a man who could not tell where the boundary was set from where the tide happened to lie." Mr. Ravenhill was out of his chair before she had finished. a reading glass in his hand, bent over the manifest like a man at his prayers. He studied the seal, the hand, the master's endorsement, and set the manifest against the purser's book and against Bligh's own copy, and no soul in that hall so much as coughed. Then he straightened and asked her, as one craftsman asks another, where the thing had lain these 200 years that no search had ever turned it up, and she told him, the store's book of a dead ship, the tarred thread, the king's excise men, and the tally clerk who sewed it safe among the salt. She handed him the pinned slip in its hurried hand, and Mr. Ravenhill read it and nodded slowly, twice over, which those who knew him said was as near to open admiration as he had come in a lifetime at the bar. It was Mr. Proud who broke first, and to his one credit that day, he broke honestly. He looked a long while, and when he stood up straight, the flourish had gone clean out of him. The hand is a purser's hand of the reign of Charles II, he said. The endorsement is sound, and the store's book bears it out, line upon line. I stated that no such grant existed. I was wrong, my lord. This document is genuine, and it is fatal to the claim. Mr. Ravenhill set down his glass and turned, not to the lord, but to his own client. Sir Hector, I have stood up in 30 years at the bar against a great many things. I will not stand up against the king's own grant. If you go on, you will lose, and pay dearly for the going on. I advise you to withdraw this night. Sir Hector Bligh sat very still, a heavy, confident man deflating slowly in his chair. Then he got to his feet, and being, under the vanity, a gentleman, he bowed first to the lord, and then, deliberately, to the young woman in gray. Madam, my father bought his claim in good faith upon a crown map, and I have spent 2 years defending a dead clerk's slip of the pen. I withdraw. And then there came the sound of slow boots upon the stone, and the hall turned, and Julian Thorne walked the whole length of it with the little iron-bound sea-chest held in both his hands, the very chest he had once put out of the counting-house, past the same clerks who had watched him do it. He stopped before her, gray to the lips, but he did not spare himself one grain. I came within a signature of giving away this harbor's finest quay, because I would not send up one loft stair for a girl I had turned off. I could not have found this in 100 years, nor read a line of it if I had. I was wrong about you, Miss Carew. He set the sea-chest down at her feet, and he bowed. She did not smile. She did not accuse. She looked down at the worn iron-bound chest that had held all she owned in the world, and when she spoke it was to the whole listening hall. My father used to say that a great house is not kept by its walls. It is kept by what it remembers. And the Dowager Lady Devereux, who had sat unregarded by the hearth the whole afternoon and missed nothing, rose, crossed the hall in front of counsel and agent and neighbor alike, and kissed the tallyman's daughter upon the cheek. And after that, not one servant along those walls pretended any longer to be about an errand. The end of the suit was a formality and a wonder in the 1 week. At the county town, the claim was withdrawn before ever it was called, with the costs against Sir Hector, and the judge, who had looked forward the whole circuit to a famous case of foreshore, was heard to say at his dinner that the only pleading worth the hearing that summer had been made in a private hall by a lady off a dead ship's manifest. The county papers, which had sharpened their pens to write of a Lord Humbled, printed instead the tale of the laundry maid, who was no laundry maid at all, but the finest reader of old commerce on that coast. Sir Hector paid every shilling of the costs, and never again disputed so much as a single mooring ring along that frontage. The lightermen and the chandlers kept their places on the Marsh Bar quay. Old Ephraim Gurnell rigged 3 ships out of that harbor before Michaelmas. And at the church door on the hill the Sunday following, the parson said nothing at all of any of it, and held Marian's hand a very long time. Mr. Proud went back to London a quieter man, and the paper he published that winter upon the Locksmere grant named Miss Marian Carew in its first sentence, and he never again valued a document by its weight to the trunk-maker. As for Julian Thorne, his letter of resignation lay upon the Lord's table the morning after the conference, and the Lord, awake half the night over it, was minded to accept the thing. It was Marian who asked him not to. "He has kept your harbor honestly for 2 years, my lord," she said. "Let the punishment fit the fault. He would not climb 1 stair. Keep him from the loft, and let him keep the quay." So the agent kept the harbor and lost the loft forever, and served on exactly and honestly. And when he retired at last to a cottage on the marsh, every Michaelmas thereafter a box of the year's clearance papers came up to the loft docketed in his own precise hand, which was, from that man, a whole apology renewed once a year. Marian Carew was made keeper of the Locksmere records at £80 the year, her father's place, upon terms she named herself. The old loft was fitted new with dry oak presses and proper lamps, and a little iron stove set into the flue, for no keeper of that room, she said, would ever again take a killing cold off the marsh for want of a fire. Above the loft door, on a plain brass plate, the Lord had them cut the name of Thomas Carew. Nan came up from the kitchens to be trained as her assistant, and the first thing she ever read out loud without help was her own name in the wages book, whereupon she burst into tears. And the manifest itself went into a case of glass and brass in the middle of the loft, where the Lord took to coming to look at it a good deal oftener than any man could easily account for. He came, in truth, the whole of that autumn, and the household, which learns everything first, began quietly to trim a second lamp. The dowager said not a word, and smiled over her needlework. In October she sent for Marian to pour her tea, examined her without mercy over the rim of the cup, and at the end said only this: that the men of this family, when their hour came upon them, courted with paper and not with pretty speeches. For his own father had wooed her with the deed of gift of a walled orchard, and that she was on no account to laugh at her son when it came. In November he climbed the loft stair with a folded draft in his hand and asked her, with great gravity, for her professional judgment upon a settlement his lawyers had engrossed. She read 3 lines and stopped. It was a marriage settlement, and the name of the bride, written out fair in the clerk's best round hand, was her own. She sat very still, one finger resting on the vellum, and he stood by the little stove and made no speech at all, having framed a good many upon the stairs and abandoned every one of them at the top. "You have put my name into a deed, my lord," she said at last. It was the only language, he said, I was certain you would trust. She took up her pen and dated it in the old style as the pursers had dated their manifests, and signed. He took her ink-stained hand and kissed it, and neither of them made a speech, and the little stove ticked in the quiet, and it was enough. They were married in the harbor church on the hill in the spring, and the altar was dressed not with hothouse flowers, but with sea-thrift and marsh samphire cut from the flats below the salt stone, and Kemble the trunk-maker sent up a small traveling writing box of new leather with a note that said only, "From the man who near enough pasted your wedding portion into a trunk." The whole quay stood 10 deep along the churchyard wall, and Nan cried the whole way through the service and denied it to every soul who asked. And when the new Lady Devereux walked out into the sunlight, she carried no posy, only her mother's mother-of-pearl prayer book, and, on a ribbon at her waist, a single small brass key, the oldest of them all, the key to the ledger loft that her father had carried for 22 years. for rank may be inherited, and a fortune may be argued in a court of law. But the soul of a great house is kept and never merely owned, and it gives itself at the last into the hands that kept it faithfully. If this story moved you, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so that you never miss our next tale of quiet dignity and worth proven before the whole assembled house. And tell us in the comments what ought to have answered the agent's resignation: his dismissal for the stair he would not climb, or the mercy that Marion chose to show him. And let us know where in the world you are watching from, and what the hour was when you finished this story. And join us next time for the story of a village schoolmistress turned away from a great house in a snowstorm, and the letter in her writing case that would bring its master to her door before the thaw. Down on the Marsh Bar quay the harbor lights went out one by one along the black water, and high in the old ledger loft a single window stayed golden into the small hours, where two heads bent close over a page 200 years old, reading.